Hey there, I'm in my office today and we're going to be talking about Chapter 8 of the textbook, which is on international business law. If we look back through U.S. history, we will see that the U.S. has gone through various cycles, continuing cycles of isolationism, and then reaching out as a global nation. Over the years, this has occurred again and again. However, since about 1946, the end of World War II, the United States has adopted the global policy, free trade policy with nations. U.S. presidents since 1946, both Democratic and Republican, have all followed the global guideline. Many economists believe that that's one of the chief reasons why the U.S. economy has skyrocketed since the days of World War II. The concept of free trade has really caught on globally. So many, almost all, but not all, nations have adopted the concept of global trade is good for us. Of course, no business can be strictly domestic. I'm balancing my iPhone on a speaker box here that no doubt was made in Malaysia or in China, and probably if you dial the 800 number, the technician answers in India. There's just no such thing as domestic only business seemingly anymore. Now here's a good question. Is international law really law at all? If we think about domestic law, if you came and hit me in the face and I sued you and I got a judgment against you, then once I got that court judgment and won the case, I could get a sheriff to seize your bank account, to seize your goods, to do all kinds of things to get my money. The sheriff would enforce my judgment. But if Germany thinks that Bolivia has cheated it out of $30 million, and Germany goes to the International Court in The Hague and gets a judgment against Bolivia, there is no international sheriff that will enforce Germany's judgment against Bolivia. So if we can't enforce judgments and laws, are they really laws to begin with? That's a good question. Okay, let's go over here for a second. Turn the page. The textbook points out there are three sources of international law. The first source is international customs. That is trading customs that have been in place sometimes since the Roman days. Everybody in global trading does it this way, and it's become a custom, and that's part of international law. The second part of international law, the textbook says, is treaties and agreements. Of course, the United States and virtually every other country has hundreds of treaties with other countries dealing with everything from tax law to tariff laws. All kinds of things are involved in treaties and agreements. And the third part of international law, says the textbook, is international organizations. Now, when we think about international organizations, the one we think of the most is the United Nations. Just really quickly on the United Nations, you have the General Assembly, which gives one vote to each of the 193 member nations of the United Nations. And if you see the president of Albania addressing the United Nations, he does it in the General Assembly, where there are 193 desks in a very large room. However, the General Assembly has virtually no power to do anything. The next part of the three parts of the United Nations is called the Secretariat, like the racehorse, Secretariat. The Secretariat is simply the executive branch of the United Nations. It's headed up by a Secretary General, and it provides studies and information and administers the various branches of the United Nations. finally, the third part, the part with real power, is the Security Council. That's made up of representatives of 15 members. 10 of those members rotate throughout the membership year to year, but 5 of those members are permanent. Those 5 permanent members are the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, and France. The idea being that since only the Security Council can really exercise power, you don't want any of the big powers in the world to believe that it's not in their interest to be in the United Nations. Therefore, any action by the Security Council can be vetoed by any of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So if the Security Council wants to send peacekeeping troops to a certain country in Africa, and everybody's ready to do it, and the Security Council is ready to go, and Russia decides we're going to veto that action ends right there. Any of those 5 nations can veto. Let's quickly talk about systems of law. There are really 2 major systems of law in the world. There's civil law and common law. If you look in chapter 8, and by the way, as you're listening to this audio, you might do well to have your outline of chapter 8 in front of you. But civil law and common law. Common law is generally exercised in those countries that were once occupied by the United Kingdom. So common law is in place in not only the United Kingdom, but the United States, Canada, Australia, Kenya, India, Israel. There are about, look in the book, there are about 20 or 30 nations that use common law. Basically, the bottom line of common law is that one judge is going to follow what the previous judge has said in a ruling. It is in theory very judge-made. Civil law, which is basically the law of most of the other countries of the world, you have a legislature making laws. In fact, not only individual laws, but that legislature writes a code of laws that might be 2,000 different paragraphs, covering everything from divorce law to criminal law to business law. That's all in a giant 2,000 paragraph code. That's how civil law countries work. But just so you don't think things are that different, in common law countries, where supposedly judges are so important, you have legislatures meeting all the time, like the Congress of the United States, passing laws, not codes made up of 2,000 paragraphs, but written laws. And in civil law countries, where judges in theory are not that important, every judge wants to follow the precedent set by previous judges. For your info, in Islamic countries, there is Islamic law. And there's probably 2 countries left on earth, Cuba and North Korea, that truly follow communist economic laws. There's a couple of principles you need to know about. We don't have much further to go here. In international law, you have your principle of comity. That means that one nation will defer and give effect to the laws and judicial decrees of another nation. If somebody in France is driving through Paris and gets in an accident, and somebody from Wisconsin that happens to be living in France for a few months injures him, and it's the Wisconsin person's fault, and the Frenchman sues him in French court and gets a judgment against him, and finally goes to Wisconsin to exercise the judgment and get his money, the Wisconsin courts are going to give effect and defer to the French judgment. That's what comity is. An act, ACT, of state doctrine, the judicial branch of one country will not examine the validity of public acts committed by a recognized foreign country. So if you don't think the recent elections in Russia have been fair, you cannot go to courts in the United States and sue because the elections in Russia were not fair, because under the Act of State Doctrine, the courts in one country, the United States, will not look into the validity of the official acts of the government of another country, in this case, Russia. Finally, sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity means that each country is sovereign unto itself, and if you want to sue a country, you have to get basically permission, because they can tell you what to do. So literally, if you sue the United States because an Air Force plane hit your farm and destroyed your farm, you can get a judgment in court, but it will take an act of Congress to actually fund that judgment, because the United States is sovereign. If you want to do business in a foreign country, you can export your items directly to consumers in that country. You can go so far as to set up manufacturing plants in that foreign country, and there's a few steps in between. Note that each country controls imports by charging tariffs on goods that are imported from other countries. Note this, however, the United States Constitution, even from the very beginning, has said that Congress cannot charge an export tax. It can charge an import tax, tariffs, but the United States cannot charge an export tax. Finally, there is an organization called the World Trade Organization, formerly called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which has been active for the past 30 or 40 years, and the main goal of the World Trade Organization is to reduce tariffs between countries of the world. And if you read your book, you will see they have done an incredible job of reducing hundreds of millions of dollars of tariffs through the year. The lower the tariffs, the more trade and the more profit can be made. Finally, there are some economic unions like the European Union, 28 or so countries that have become one market. There used to be the North American Free Trade Agreement, which just a couple of years ago has been superseded by a trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, which does much the same thing, tried to lower tariffs and increase trade between the three countries. One more thing, just like domestically we have the Uniform Commercial Code, which is a set of laws for domestic business transactions, in international law there's something called the CISG, four initials, CISG, which is a set of international rules adopted by very, very, very many nations, which set forth the commercial rules for trade between nations. That's it. Great. Thanks.